In the quiet village of Gwanmi, nestled between Korea's dense forests and misty mountains, life moved at its own unhurried pace. Ji-Hoon, a diligent farmer in his mid-20s, lived with his aging grandmother in a modest house overlooking rice fields. The villagers were close-knit, sharing meals, stories, and superstitions passed down through generations. Among these tales was the story of the Jeoseung Saja, the grim reaper said to come for souls when their time had run out. Ji-Hoon always dismissed these as mere myths, relics of a bygone era meant to scare children into obedience. His grandmother often warned him not to mock such stories, but he would laugh it off. One evening, as they sat outside under a moonlit sky, she told him about a time when she was young and saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest. "It wasn't human," she whispered. Ji-Hoon chuckled nervously but felt an odd chill in the air. Suddenly, a streak of light cut across the sky, brighter than any shooting star he had ever seen. His grandmother froze, her face pale. "That's no star," she murmured. "It's an omen." The next morning, an unsettling rumor spread through the village like wildfire. Mr. Kong, an elderly man who lived alone near the forest's edge, had vanished overnight. His door was left wide open, and his dinner remained untouched on the table. Villagers whispered about strange footprints leading away from his home into the woods, but no one dared to follow them. Ji-Hoon couldn't shake off a sense of unease as he passed by Mr. Kang's empty house on his way to the fields. The air felt heavier than usual, and even the birds seemed quieter. That night, during dinner, his grandmother spoke in hushed tones about how disappearances like this had happened before, always accompanied by sightings of a tall figure dressed in black. "The Jeoseung Saja doesn't come without reason," she said gravely. Ji-Hoon dismissed her words again, but couldn't ignore the knot forming in his stomach. Later that night, as Ji-Hoon lay in bed staring at the wooden beams of his ceiling, sleep eluded him. He kept thinking about Mr. Kong and those mysterious footprints leading into the forest. Just as he began to drift off, he heard it, a faint whisper that seemed to come from outside his window. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but then it grew louder and clearer. Ji-Hoon, his name was being called in a voice that sounded neither male nor female but eerily hollow. He shot up from his bed and rushed to the window, only to find nothing but darkness outside. Trembling, he closed the shutters tightly and tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. That night brought no peace for Ji-Hoon as he fell into a restless sleep filled with strange visions. In his dream, he stood alone in an endless gray field shrouded in mist so thick it felt suffocating. A shadowy figure emerged from the fog, tall and cloaked in black robes that seemed to ripple like liquid darkness. Though its face was obscured by shadows, its presence radiated an undeniable authority and dread. The figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at Ji-Hoon before calling his name 3 times. Ji-Hoon, Ji-Hoon, Ji-Hoon. Each repetition echoed louder than the last until it became deafening. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. When Ji-Hoon recounted his dream to his grandmother over breakfast, her reaction startled him more than the dream itself. She dropped her spoon with a clatter and grabbed his hands tightly. "If he called your name 3 times, she said with trembling lips, "it means you've been marked." Her words sent a shiver down Ji-Hoon's spine despite his attempts to remain skeptical. She explained that according to legend, once someone is marked by the Jeoseung Saja, their days are numbered unless they can find a way to appease or outwit him. Determined not to let fear consume him, Ji-Hoon decided to investigate Mr. Kang's disappearance himself despite his grandmother's protests. Armed with nothing but a lantern and his resolve, he ventured toward the forest where Kang's footprints had reportedly led. The villagers watched him go with apprehension but said nothing. They didn't want to draw attention from whatever force had taken Kang. As Ji-Hoon entered the forest's shadowy embrace, an unnatural silence enveloped him. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. As Ji-Hoon ventured deeper into the forest, his lantern's flickering light barely pierced the dense darkness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. He followed the faint trail of footprints, which grew fainter with each step, as if they were being erased by an unseen force. Suddenly, he noticed something glinting on the ground, a small, blackened coin. Picking it up, he felt a chill run through his fingers, as though the object had been sitting in ice. The air around him grew colder, and a low whisper began to echo through the trees. "Turn back," it said, barely audible but unmistakable. Ji-Hoon spun around, his heart pounding, but no one was there. He clutched the coin tightly and pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind Mr. Kang's disappearance. Deeper in the forest, Ji-Hoon stumbled upon a clearing dominated by a single massive tree. Its bark was blackened and cracked as if it had been struck by lightning long ago, yet it stood tall and imposing. Strange symbols were carved into its trunk, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse faintly under the moonlight. Ji-Hoon felt drawn to the tree despite an overwhelming sense of dread washing over him. As he reached out to touch its surface, a sudden gust of wind extinguished his lantern, plunging him into complete darkness. In that moment, he heard it again, the same hollow voice from his dream calling his name. Ji-Hoon. This time, it was closer and more insistent. He stumbled backward, tripping over roots as he scrambled to relight his lantern. Ji-Hoon returned to the village shaken but alive. However, his relief was short-lived when news broke that another villager had vanished overnight, a young woman named Su-min who often gathered herbs near the forest's edge. Her family found her basket lying abandoned on the path, but no sign of her anywhere. The villagers were gripped with fear, whispering that the Jeoseung Saja was taking them one by one. Ji-Hoon couldn't ignore the eerie connection between Su-min's disappearance and his own experiences in the forest. He decided to visit her family to gather more clues, but found them too distraught to speak coherently. As he left their home, he noticed something peculiar, a faint trail of blackened leaves leading toward the woods. Following the trail of blackened leaves, Ji-Hoon ventured once again into the forest despite his grandmother's desperate pleas for him to stay away. This time, he brought offerings, a silver coin and an orange, based on old legends he had read about appeasing spirits. As he walked deeper into the woods, he came across something chilling, Su-min's scarf hanging from a low branch, torn and stained with what looked like ash. Nearby, he found more strange symbols etched into rocks and trees, symbols identical to those on the massive tree he had seen before. The whispers returned, louder now and more insistent. "Leave, before it's too late." Ji-Hoon felt a presence watching him but refused to turn back. As Ji-Hoon approached another clearing in the forest, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The air grew colder with each step until his breath came out in visible puffs despite it being midsummer. Then he saw it, a figure cloaked in black standing motionless at the center of the clearing. Its face was obscured by shadows beneath its hood, but its presence was unmistakable. This was the Jeoseung Saja. Ji-Hoon froze in place as their eyes met, or at least what he assumed were eyes beneath that impenetrable darkness. "Why do you seek me?" the figure asked in a voice that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Summoning all his courage, Ji-Hoon replied, "I want answers." The Reaper tilted its head slightly before vanishing into thin air without another word. Shaken by his encounter with the Jeoseung Saja, Ji-Hoon returned home and demanded answers from his grandmother about why these events were happening now. After much hesitation, she revealed a dark family secret. Generations ago, one of their ancestors had cheated death by tricking a grim reaper into sparing their life in exchange for another soul's sacrifice. Ever since then, their family had been cursed. The Jeoseung Saja would return every few decades to claim what was owed. "You've been marked because our debt is due," she said with tears streaming down her face. Determined not to succumb to this curse without a fight, Ji-Hoon began preparing himself for another confrontation with the Jeoseung Saja. He sought advice from elders in neighboring villages who shared their own tales of encounters with death spirits and how they had survived them, though none could offer guarantees against such a powerful force. Armed with protective charms made from silver and salt as well as offerings meant to distract or appease spirits, including oranges, Ji-Hoon set traps around his home and carried these items wherever he went. The village was blanketed in an unnatural fog that night, thicker than anything Ji-Hoon had ever seen. It crept in from the forest like a living entity, swallowing the homes and streets in its cold embrace. The villagers huddled together in their homes, whispering prayers and clutching talismans. Ji-Hoon stood outside, his silver coin clutched tightly in one hand and an orange in the other. He had set up protective charms around the village, hoping they would buy them more time. As the fog thickened, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, echoing through the silence. Ji-Hoon turned toward the sound and saw a shadow moving through the mist. It was tall and cloaked, its form barely visible but undeniably menacing. The Jeoseung Saja had come. The Jeoseung Saja emerged from the fog, its black robes flowing as if caught in an invisible wind. Its face remained hidden beneath its hood, but Ji-Hoon could feel its gaze piercing through him. "You cannot escape fate," it said in a voice that resonated like a distant thunderstorm. Ji-Hoon swallowed his fear and stepped forward, holding out the orange and silver coin. "Take these," he said, his voice trembling. "Spare my village." The Reaper tilted its head as if considering his offer before reaching out with a skeletal hand to take the items. For a moment, Ji-Hoon thought he had succeeded, but then the Reaper spoke again. "A debt must still be paid. I will take what is owed, unless you offer something greater." Ji-Hoon's heart sank as he realized what the Jeoseung Saja was asking for, a life in exchange for sparing the others. He looked around at the empty streets of his village, knowing that every soul here depended on him to protect them. "Take me," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The Reaper paused, as if surprised by his willingness. "You would give yourself so freely?" it asked. Ji-Hoon nodded, tears welling in his eyes but resolve hardening his expression. "If it means saving them, then yes." The Reaper extended its hand toward him, but instead of taking him immediately, it said, "You have until dawn to say your goodbyes." Word of Ji-Hoon's sacrifice spread quickly through the village, and by morning, every villager had gathered outside his home to bid him farewell. His grandmother wept openly, clutching him tightly as if she could hold him back from his fate. "There must be another way," she pleaded, but Ji-Hoon shook his head. "This is my choice," he said softly. The villagers offered him gifts, food, trinkets, and prayers, but none could ease the weight of what lay ahead. As dawn approached, Ji-Hoon walked alone to the edge of the forest where the Jeoseung Saja awaited. The clearing where Ji-Hoon first encountered the Jeoseung Saja was bathed in pale moonlight as he stepped into it for what he believed would be the last time. The Reaper stood silently at its center, its presence as imposing as ever. "You are ready?" it asked when Ji-Hoon approached. He nodded without hesitation. But just as the Reaper raised its hand to claim him, something unexpected happened. A blinding light erupted from Ji-Hoon's chest where he had placed one of his grandmother's protective talismans earlier that day. The Reaper recoiled slightly but did not retreat entirely. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Ji-Hoon standing unharmed before the Jeoseung Saja. "You are not like others," it said slowly, almost curiously. "Your soul carries both defiance and acceptance." For a moment that felt like an eternity, neither moved nor spoke until finally, the Reaper lowered its hand. "Your sacrifice has been acknowledged," it said before vanishing into thin air without taking him or anyone else from the village that night, or ever again. Ji-Hoon returned home to a hero's welcome but was forever changed by his encounter with death itself. Though he lived many more years surrounded by those he loved most dearly, he could never quite shake off the feeling that one day, somewhere, the Jeoseung Saja would return. The legend of Jeoseung Saja, the Korean Grim Reaper, remains deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness of Korea. As a figure that embodies the inevitability of death, Jeoseung Saja is not a malevolent spirit but a dutiful guide tasked with escorting souls to the afterlife. His presence serves as a reminder of life's fragility and the importance of living with integrity and purpose. In Ji-Hoon's story, the encounter with Jeoseung Saja left an indelible mark not only on him but also on his village. Though he survived his confrontation with the Reaper, Ji-Hoon carried the weight of his sacrifice for the rest of his days. The villagers, too, learned to respect the balance between life and death, often leaving offerings at the edge of the forest to honor the unseen forces that govern their fate. The tale of Ji-Hoon's bravery spread far beyond his village, becoming a cautionary story told to children and travelers alike. It reminded listeners that while death is inevitable, it is not something to be feared if one lives a life of kindness and courage. The Jeoseung Saja, though feared by many, is ultimately a symbol of balance, a figure who ensures that no soul is left wandering aimlessly between worlds. To this day, Whispers about Jeoseung Saja persist in Korea. Some claim to have seen his shadowy figure in hospitals or near accident sites, always silent and patient as he waits for his next task. Others believe that dreaming of him is an omen of impending death, urging individuals to reflect on their lives before it is too late. Regardless of how he is perceived, Jeoseung Saja remains an enduring symbol of mortality and the mysterious journey that follows. For those who hear this story, one lesson stands out. When faced with forces beyond comprehension, it is not resistance but acceptance, and perhaps even reverence, that allows one to find peace. The legend of Jeoseung Saja reminds us all that while death may be inevitable, it is how we live that truly defines us.